Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us for today's SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. It's Wednesday, January 11th, 2023, and today we're going to be answering three questions we've been hearing from international educators over the last 7 days. And as we do each week, we take our news stories from our newsletter that comes out on Mondays at 9 a.m. Eastern. For those that wish to subscribe, I'm dropping the link into the chat along with the most recent edition of the newsletter so that you can get a gander on what our stories are that we cover this week and how we get to the kinds of questions that we ask here on the Roundup on Wednesdays. So we provide this service free of charge to all that wish to subscribe, and we do this both through an email version as well as through LinkedIn. We have our own newsletter there as well, basically the same thing that you could get via email. So I'll drop that if that's the way you prefer to digest your international ed news. We do the work for you. We do our research on top news stories and social media that are related to international education, as well as top international ed stories, not only in the United States, but around the world that impact what we do in international education. And like we do each week, we take three themes that we see percolating through those news stories and come up with our questions that we answer here on the Roundup on Wednesday. We give you our hot takes on Monday on those different news stories, and then here we'll dive a little deeper and maybe flesh out some things that might be useful as you look to put together or adapt pieces of your international ed strategy to respond to some of these changing needs in the marketplace. So we want to give a special shout out to those who watch us live here on our social media channels for SMIE Consulting. We go live at 1 p.m. Eastern every Wednesday. Whether we're here in the United States or abroad at a conference, we try and do this every Wednesday, unless we're on a plane where we can't do it at that time. So we appreciate those of you who watch live on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter. And a special thank you to those who download our podcast each week. We've broken 2,200 downloads now, have over 100 subscribers, so very pleased to have you as part of the international ed journey for our SMIE Consulting organization. So thank you so much. And let's get right into our first question of the day, and that is, how have community colleges fared during the Great Resignation? There's been a lot said over the last 3 years about what's happened in higher education. We saw 16% of college and university workforces leave or be let go or put on furlough during the pandemic. We've seen some institutions that didn't have huge layoffs that furloughed employees during the pandemic that have now recently, in fact, the institution that I work at currently, University of Nevada, Las Vegas, they recently, for those that were employed throughout the pandemic who were furloughed, they've given them basically the equivalent of back pay for the time that they were off the clock, so to speak. So there's been a huge restructuring of institutions, reorganizing how we do what we do in higher ed, how we deliver courses, all of these things that we've talked about before here on the Roundup. But I want to pay particular attention to the community colleges today, simply because they were already one of the areas, particularly as it relates to international education, that were struggling the most. We know for a fact that several folks who had international job responsibilities were either let go during the pandemic that were in community college positions for international education. We know that if that happened, as much like it does in many other parts of community college life, you may have those individuals who assume those responsibilities of international student recruitment or international being a DSO at a community college or providing services for international students, had that added to their plate. Usually wasn't any new positions created during the pandemic. And the reason why we cover this today is oftentimes our community college brothers and sisters are kind of the last to benefit from any boom periods, and often first to suffer whenever there's a downturn in any significant way. Where the one time where perhaps they began to saw significant upticks was in the last recession in 2008 around around all the banking scandals and such. Stock market collapses and all of that. We saw folks who were leaving the job market who were going back in community colleges to get retrained to do something else. And there are periods that they tend to benefit from that perhaps, and larger higher ed to a lesser extent. But what we're facing now in the pandemic, coming out of the pandemic, there was an interesting article I've put the link to in the chat on Facebook and YouTube, but you'll certainly get to that from the links if you're subscribed to the newsletter. It's a Chronicle article that's open to those that who you don't need a subscription to read this particular piece. The data shows from EAB. That community college leaders have seen the information services sector seen a steady increase in jobs in that time period at community colleges, climbing from 16% between January of 2020 and April 22. And that's, I guess, not a surprise. That's probably the one area that that community colleges did not lose in staff is in the IT area. So information services, as everything went online, that really has led to that's kind of the only bright light, where overall the trends and the graph that's on this attached to this article here for community college staffing lags is the title or the tag for the graph. You see very distinct drop-offs between January of 2020 and January of 22. Shortly, that's where things in the fall of 21 and early January 22. That's when things kind of bottomed out. Where they were seeing drops of 15-16% across the board at community colleges. So you see, and we know, as I mentioned earlier, we know when it comes to international ed, oftentimes, those of you, my colleagues who are working in community colleges, I know your struggles in terms of the number of hats that you wear. You're underpaid, you're overworked, you have international, perhaps if you're lucky, you have international as your only responsibility. But oftentimes, I know you have other responsibilities on campus that might be in completely unrelated areas. But that can be a real challenge in terms of where you are and in terms of your ability to function appropriately. Some of you left community college world because there were jobs opening up when higher ed started rebounding in mid 21 into the spring of 22. You saw huge rebounds on the higher ed side, but that's also at the time in the spring of 21 where there was a huge drop off from April 21 to January 22. You were going from slightly above, maybe regaining some ground on the job losses at the beginning of the pandemic, but then you really tanked throughout the back half of 21 into early 22, and only are just now starting to make an upward trend again. So for me, I know community colleges oftentimes are portrayed as the better, not better, but it depends on the individual who's viewing them. But certainly, community colleges can be a very appropriate and worthwhile path for international students for whom finances are a particular concern, where they don't have the wealth to throw out $50,000 per year on an education, on tuition alone in some cases, or those that don't know exactly what they want yet and want to have a year or two to play around with different kinds of programs that they've had interest in, but don't know exactly whether or not that's going to be the right one for them, and they want to have that college experience and not have to pay top dollar for that. So it's really community colleges have always had a valid pathway for international students. They haven't always gotten the love from consular officers overseas in terms of visa processing and their willingness to grant visas for community colleges, despite all the work that those community college representatives have done to convince students in some countries where community colleges are certainly not a thing in terms of a known quantity, and certainly not a ready-made and understood path to higher education, to a degree in higher education in their countries. But community college international folks work so hard in terms of making that push and convincing leadership or at schools, parents of students that might be interested, and students themselves who might need some encouragement to have opportunities for the beginning of an undergraduate education that won't cost an arm and a leg necessarily, but will provide them options and a pathway, clear pathway to finishing a 4-year degree. And that's something that work that's done when it's not recognized by consular officers who do not at embassies and consulates around the world as a valid pathway to a bachelor's degree program in the United States. They're really doing a disservice to community colleges in the United States who have worked so hard to get to that point and already have those kind of obstacles built up in terms of being able to explain what a community college is, convince a parent and a student that that's the right way and that there is a clear path to success. One of my colleagues, she's talked about actively how students that have come to her, she talks about the example of a student that did an associate's with them, went on to a 4-year state university to finish a bachelor's degree, and is now doing another degree in Canada, an advanced degree in Canada. So that's a clear pathway to a successful future. And community colleges can and do that and have done that for decades for international students. And the impact of the pandemic on these community colleges during the Great Resignation has been more significant. They felt it 10, 15 times as hard as we have on the university side, just because of the resource constraints that they have always had. There aren't suddenly fresh budgets that are suddenly funding dozens of positions on these community college campuses, but yet the expectations are you still got to bring in the students. Those that have stuck through it, I know the work has been hard. You've worked above and beyond in terms of what's required to do your jobs and to bring in students even throughout this, coming out of the pandemic now. We're seeing your success. We're there for you, and we wish you nothing but the best and know that we support you in what you do. And George, thanks for getting on. And yes, let's definitely connect about some international discussions on these kinds of topics and more. Look forward to those conversations. Thanks for being a part of the Roundup today. So let's move on to our second topic of the day. And this one is fresh on the minds of all international admissions folks around the country, around the world, who are anxiously awaiting Chinese students to start flooding back to their countries now that the borders are fully open and that there are no quarantine restrictions and passports are beginning to be reissued again by Chinese National Passport Control. So January 8th, this past Monday or Sunday, was the beginning of this new open China in terms of their what they consider their post-pandemic restrictions being lifted. So, now that the borders are open, where will these students be going? There's a lot of talk in the industry about what's going to be expected down the road in the coming months. We've had surveys done, and we'll share some of the results of those through some of the articles we'll be putting in the chat. But I wanted to first highlight a webinar coming up on Wednesday this coming week from today. It's at 5:30 a.m. Eastern, so early for my U.S. colleagues, really late for on the West Coast. But it's what is on the mind of Chinese students, how to use digital to engage them. It's being put on by the PIES doing the webinar, and sponsored by Synorbis, Lancaster University in the UK, and British Council. So UK folks are primarily running this. Synorbis, if you're not familiar, is Australia-based. They've been operating in China for several years as an online digital platform to provide universities access to the Chinese student market directly behind the Great Firewall. So that is a webinar I'm signed up for. I certainly encourage you to do the same. If you can register, you'll get the recording, so you don't have to get up super early to watch it live at 5:30 on the East Coast, 2:30 a.m. on the West Coast. And that's certainly that on the ground kind of knowledge in terms of what's happening with Chinese students now. What are they seeing on the ground that will help help us get a better sense of what's next. We also have a story, another PI story coming out related to what Chinese agents are particularly concerned about, that they feel are going to be the top deciding factors for where students will go. And that's going to be a useful resource to check out as well. And that rating is actually from Navitas Agents Perception Survey, 880 agents across 68 countries. So it's not just China. It also includes agents around the world, 68 countries, obviously. But for China, in rankings in Greater China, agent was the top factor that was going to decide where students go, in their opinion, the agents that were surveyed here. That has grown significantly from 68% of agents in May in China said would be rankings were a top factor. It's now grown to 80% by October in this most recent survey. So now that the borders are open, our ranking's still going to drive a Chinese student interest primarily to ranked schools. What is the feeling? According to the agents, rankings is going to be a significant driver coming out. We also have just also getting some feedback on from different sources inside and outside of China that know the market well about the COVID testing requirement that has been put in place for those Chinese citizens that might be traveling to the U.S., U.K., Australia, not New Zealand, however, in terms of COVID testings before they travel to their destination of choice for study. So that is something that I think, and you've seen the Chinese government say that this is discriminatory and all that. To be honest with you, the culture they're just blowing wind, hot air, as far as I'm concerned. For the Chinese culture has been multiple testings per week before they get on a plane, to travel, to have that be a concern. It's very insignificant in the bigger picture. They're used to having to be tested regularly, and to do that before they get on a plane is not going to be a deal breaker for folks in terms of them being able to travel. What I would say is going to be an issue that these testing rules we see, and you think about it, that you have to go into China, even though there's not a quarantine, you do still need to have a negative test before you go to China. So it's kind of pot calling the kettle black at that point. What we are seeing on the ground in China is a lot of confusion. Frankly, we know what's happened since. In December, the government pulled back on their COVID restrictions internally within the country. They allowed greater range of travel. This has also coincided with huge explosion of COVID cases, where in one province, there was even a report that 89% of the province's population had gotten COVID. 89% in one province that has 100 million people. 89 million people had COVID in Henan province. So that's kind of scary for us, when you think about why that's happening. When you suddenly go from 3 years of lockdown to in various stages to not unfettered. They don't have unfettered freedom of travel in China, but unfettered movement and less restrictions. And all of a sudden, these explosion of cases are clogging hospitals, much like we had in the U.S. in the early days of the pandemic in 2020. We're now seeing those stories play out again in China, and perhaps on a much greater scale than we ever had here, in terms of the impact it's going to have on their population, particularly the elderly, that were the most resistant to getting the vaccines in the first place. And even those that did get the vaccines, they're less effective in terms of preventing significant symptoms of and effects of COVID. 50%. The Chinese government did not let in Western vaccines for its citizens. They only relied on their own, Sinopharm and Sinovac. So, and maybe a couple others that popped up later. But certainly the efficacy of those has caused some real struggles. One of those is in terms of changes in regulations and restrictions of what you could and couldn't do. For Chinese university students that were undergraduate students that were looking to take the graduate school entrance exams, there was a report out that there were, I think, over let me get the total numbers here. There were approximately 4.57 million persons officially registered for the postgraduate test. That was happening December 24th to December 26th. That there was a high no-show rates. That some are close to a third of the individuals who registered, about 1.6 million, based on the stats that have been compiled. 1.6 million of those 4.57 million students that were going to take the postgraduate entrance exam didn't show for the test because of confusion related to the exams and what was allowed in post-COVID China, which is hard to say that with a straight face at this point. But in terms of, there's a lot of confusion, obviously, on the ground as we're outlining here. But we're also dealing with a country that the pressure now that the borders are open, there still aren't the flights that were in and out of China that existed pre-pandemic, and that's going to be the biggest probably bottleneck for students that are hoping to travel abroad and get to the United States to start their studies or resume their studies if they've been out of the country for a while. We talked last week about the problem for U.S. bound students. The embassies and consulates have stopped non-immigrant visa services. So for new students, they probably aren't going to get here for spring and are going to have to defer again until fall if they hadn't already deferred. So we're experiencing a lot of stop and starts here with this. With re-engaging with China in significant numbers. And I think that there's still, it's probably going to be fall 23 before we'll see anywhere close to a return to pre-pandemic numbers. And even those numbers had been declining over the previous 3 or 4 years. So it's a big uphill climb for Chinese students in terms of getting back in expectations for us. Certainly in the U.S. Certainly, I've heard from several colleagues in Australia that expect Chinese numbers to bounce back significantly in the next year or so. I think that might happen. Certainly the agent surveys that we talked about last week shared that Australia is certainly rebounding significantly in terms of preferred destination. Whether that's all of that turns into actual students, I think they'll see increases. They can't get any worse than where they were during the pandemic. But certainly the sticking point has been with China up until now. I think it was up to a third of their Chinese students were still in China doing remote courses because they couldn't get in country. So now that the borders are open, as soon as flights resume in significant numbers to and from major Western destinations, I think there's until that happens, it's probably going to be late spring, our spring, their fall, when their school year starts in the coming month or two, that they're going to be expecting larger volume. So hopefully for their benefit, I hope they do see that resumption in Chinese students. But one place where they're not going is back in significant numbers is Canada. Article that I've just dropped in to the chat is from Eridera that routinely does profiles on different destination markets and source markets and how they connect. Where we look at Chinese applicants for study permits in Canada, those numbers have dropped significantly. They were at 90,000 Chinese study permits in 2018 to less than 52,000 for 2022. So significant drops there, 38% or so. But Canada has seen increases overall, and so the drop in the Chinese students that they've experienced in Canada has been masked by significant jumps, particularly from India, that they've experienced even during the pandemic. So it'll be interesting to see whether Canada can regain any of its lost market share from China going to north of the border to Canada. So we'll keep our eyes on that as their numbers come in for the next few months. But what we're seeing with China right now is a lot of uncertainty on the part of U.S. bound students from China because of the embassy issues and the closure there. Whenever that gets reopened, it's kind of hard to say until things settle down on the COVID front. And that's the technical disadvantage of U.S. bound students from China, is that we require, unless they fall into the interview waiver exemption that has been granted through the end of December 23 for those that had previous U.S. visas. If they need a visa, first-time visa, they have to go for an in-person interview. We're the only major Western country that requires it. So that's why the UK saw jumps in their Chinese student visa applicants and students actually getting to the UK, is because they don't require that in-person interview. They have private visa processing services that students apply through, and that there are security checks that are government regulated and all that, but they don't require the interview. Canada doesn't require an interview. Australia doesn't require an interview. So there's the process is a lot simpler. So I say to my colleagues who are just trying to understand more of what's happening in the wider world, well, that's one of the reasons we fall down quite a bit in terms of the processing delays that we face for U.S. bound students happen because of that in-person requirement, because there aren't physically enough appointments in the day for everybody who wants to come from India to go for their U.S. student visa interview, because that's a requirement unless they have the previous U.S. visa in the last 5 years. So will we see any changes to that, the in-person requirement? The only thing that light at the end of that tunnel is if they extend and make permanent. If you've had a U.S. visa in the last 5 years and they make that in-person visa requirement, if they waive that, like they have during the last couple of years of the pandemic and into the end of 23, if they make that permanent, then that's one avenue. But it's still, the in-person requirement just is a real roadblock, because the security checks really happen in the background anyway. There isn't a whole lot you can learn. Visa consular officers probably will tell you differently, but in terms of what you learn from actually meeting that person, that you're not seeing on paper. There'll be some benefit in there, I'm sure, but when it's a clear hindrance to success in terms of visas processing, it's something that needs addressing in the longer term. Are there other ways to do interviews that don't have to require in person, or a 5-minute interview can be done on Skype or on some other sort of service? So there's a lot that we can talk about there, but hopefully we'll see rebounds coming from China in the next semester. Certainly fall term is probably the most likely where we'll see some significant jumps. And for those who are curious about China and the United States, I think there's other articles we shared in the newsletter about what's the future for U.S.-China relations. Much like we saw during the Cold War with Russia, there was student exchange going on throughout that. I think we're going to get to a point with China where the student exchange will continue, and I think we'll get back to a more normal state. It's not going to be the volume that we had in the mid-noughties to early teens, but I certainly think that there's still a lot to be learned from cooperating with China on academic projects, on student exchange. There's just so much value in that person-to-person diplomacy. So I still think there's going to be huge opportunities for the United States in this regard. Now, the final question of the day. The second largest country, or largest depending on whose population numbers you look at these days, is India. Is it poised to boom, not just with outbound students, but with inbound students too? And there are a couple of interesting articles that came out this week that I want to share with you today, one of which, both are from the Free Press Journal. Excuse me, big frog. First one is Bigger Countries to Challenge the U.S.-UK Dominance Among Indian Students in 2023. And this one is sharing a report that right now there are a little over 600,000 Indian students studying outside of India for higher education. There's a recent report from Redseer, which estimates that in the next 2 years, or less than 2 years now, by 2024, even into early next year, end of 2024, there could be 1.8 million Indians studying abroad. And that just seems like a phenomenal increase in such a short span of time. And you wonder, is that real? Could that possibly be? And if it is, it certainly would be explained with the interest that I think we've seen in the United States explode from Indian sources, Indian students over the last 2 to 3 years. And the U.S. consulates and embassies in India have been struggling to keep up, and in the past year had a record number of visas issued to try and meet that demand, but that's still not enough. By the end of 2023, hopefully by the fall, summer 23, the new embassy, our new consulate in Hyderabad, the world's largest U.S. consulate, will be open and be able to funnel through many more students than they have been able to recently. So there's huge, just almost unlimited demand right now in India for overseas education. Now, not all of that 1.8 million, which would be tripling what they have going abroad right now from the country, not just to the U.S., but globally. Not all of that's coming to the U.S. The article points out specifically that Germany and France have been some of the bigger recipients of increases of Indian students outbound in the last 3 years. Germany primarily because it's free. France to a lesser extent, but still they've been reaping the rewards of some investment in India. The other side of the coin here on this question is India poised to become a huge destination market for international students? And part of that is driven by the UGC in India sharing the recent guidance on what the criteria will be for universities that wish to set up their own campuses in India. China's had it for a while. Other countries have been inviting foreign universities in for a number of years. But now India, it's a hugely bureaucratic country, hugely diverse, decentralized country in a lot of ways. But the NEP, National Education Policy, that was introduced a couple of years ago, some of the fruits of that, in terms of promising a more open India for international education, for inbound international education to the country, for allowance of overseas campuses of foreign institutions. Those criteria are now being finalized. Just saw something this morning about what those criteria are. They're looking for those institutions. They will put rankings on institutions that they will allow in to set up shop. That you have to have been in the world top 500. They don't specify which rankings. But again, it elevates the question of rankings are going to be a predetermining factor for who they'll allow in to open up a campus. We don't know all the scale. They say that they have interest from 49 universities across 6 or 7, 8 countries that want to set up shop in India as a way to offer their degrees from their own country in India, but also to allow others from the region who might want to come to India, perhaps for the student experience, the cultural experience, lower cost experience, to have the benefit of getting that degree from an overseas university in India. So that kind of TNE is going to be exploding in India in the next, if the UGC is to be believed, it's going to be exploding in India in the next 3 to 5 years. And we'll see if they say 49 universities are going to set up shop in India in this year. I'll believe it when I see it, but that's a huge opportunity for institutions that have the guts to do it. It's going to be a huge capital expense to open a shop in India. Whether it's full degrees or only individual degrees, I think for an institution like mine at UNLV, one of the caveats, top 500. If you're not in the top 500, what do you do? If you're top 500 in a particular program, you potentially, if I'm reading these requirements right, you could potentially be setting up shop in India. So there's a huge opportunity in India, both inbound and outbound, for students, for institutions. And I think that's only going to grow as the dust settles from these new regulations, and we have a better idea of what to expect. But that's all we have for you this week on the Roundup. Do appreciate you sticking with us, and we hope that we'll be chatting with you in person or at events in the next few months. So until next time, have a great day.